Okay, today we start with a keynote. This is the first time that Esther Derby is here with us at the Agile testing days, and I hope it's not going to be the last time.
Oh, no.
And we never met before, so it's a pleasure for me too. And Esther Derby is well known and recognized in the field of the human side of software development. And she has wrote a lot of articles, over 100 articles, and has several books. One on with Johanna Rothman, other else on a very good book. And Behind Closed Doors. Thanks. A very nice book. If you haven't read it, please read it. It's a very good one. It's a very good one. And yeah, she started her career as programmer, system manager, internal consultant, today with her own company. And yeah, she's also a member of the Agile Alliance, doing a lot for the community. I'm very, very happy that she's here today. Thank you very much for coming, your audience.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So I actually started my professional career as a programmer. So does anybody in this room know how to tell a professional programmer? Anybody know how to tell a professional programmer? No, those are the ones who are on death marches. So they're working crazy hours. Linda, you don't know? Johanna?
I still think they drink Coke.
No, it has nothing to do with what they drink. It's professional programmers take their card deck and they put a pattern across the card deck so that when they drop the box, it's easy to resort. That's how you tell a professional programmer. And the real pros don't number sequentially. They leave a big gap because they know they're going to need more cards. And they use rubber bands.
That's true.
So when I started, that's how you could tell a professional programmer. They had the pattern on their cards, and they held their deck with rubber bands. Because, you know, we learned about patterns. We learned what happened when you drop your box of cards, right? You drop your box of cards, and unless you have taken these precautions, it's going to take a long time to get them back in place. So that's about recognizing a pattern and doing something with the system to make it work a little better. This is a talk about people and patterns. So I'm going to talk about several patterns, and I'm going to talk about how humans often deal with patterns and give you some tools to understand the patterns in your organization and have some ideas about how to shift them. So how many of you have the pattern in your organization of people showing up late for meetings? Yeah, that's a common one. Okay, so let's talk about that. How many of you work in organizations where people always show up on time for meetings? 1, 2 hands. Okay, so this is a common thing that happens. What usually happens when people notice that someone is showing up late for meetings, what do? Do they say, "Oh, you're part of a pattern"? No, they say, "Show some respect. Manage your time better. You should show up on time. If you cared about the time of your colleagues and had respect for your colleagues, you'd show up on time." How many of you have heard something like that? Yeah, so blaming an individual who's actually part of a bigger pattern. So this is what happens in organizations, because in general, as humans, we focus on the events, right? And particularly when we're under time pressure and there are all sorts of things coming at us, we focus on the single event that's right in front of us, right? And sometimes we do need to focus on the events. If the server's down, you do need to respond to that. But if you really want to create change in your organization, you can't only look at events and respond to the current state. You have to look underneath the events and begin to discern patterns. Patterns are repeated events that have meaning over time. You can observe patterns, you can depict patterns, and once you know something about those patterns, you can begin to model them, understand the underlying dynamics and the structures that are driving behavior, and then you stand a chance of really changing the behavior you see in organizations. So, those of you who have been blamed for being late for meetings, does that actually change the behavior? No, because it's part of a pattern, right? Okay, so let's look at this pattern of being late for meetings. And we're going to look at it in terms of the effects that it has on the organization. Because what I see most often when there is an isolated event, it's difficult for people to think about it in terms of its temporal effects and the ripple effects across the organization. Humans are really good at spatial reasoning, but we're not so good at temporal reasoning. So one of the things we can do to help ourselves become better systems thinkers and better at seeing patterns is to take advantage of our facility for spatial reasoning and put temporal events into a spatial form. Does that make sense? Yeah. So that's what this is about. You start with the central problem. In this case, people are late for meetings. And then you look at who else is affected by this. What other groups are affected by this? What other people are affected when people are late for our meeting? Say it's a planning meeting. What happens when people are late for planning meetings? Well, it affects all these other groups. And who else does it affect? Well, if it's affecting release planning, it's affecting product development. If we were trying to bring in a candidate to participate in one of our planning meetings to see how he would respond in that event, well, then it's affecting the candidate. It's affecting HR. Oops, how did that happen? Anyway, so it goes out in expanding concentric circles. And you can begin to see that this is not just an event that affects the people in the meeting, that it ripples throughout the organization. This sort of diagramming is a spatial depiction of events that happen over time that helps people see the interconnectedness and the complexity of an issue. And once you can see the interconnectedness, you can start thinking about what happens when things are going well in this central circle. How does that affect the other circles? What happens when things are going badly? How does that affect the other circles? And you begin to get a deeper sense of the connectedness of the organization, which pulls you out of event thinking and helps you get into pattern thinking. We're going to come back to this issue, but this is a very simple way of helping expose the complexity underlying events and the interconnectedness underlying events. Another simple way is by just depicting process, depicting the flows of communication. So I visited one organization where this manager had a very nice idea about how to organize the work in his company. And he decided that they would have one prioritized backlog. Does this sound familiar to anyone? One prioritized backlog, yes? And that any one of the developers could pull an item from that backlog and work on it. Doesn't that sound nice and efficient and neat? Yes? It does sound all of those things. It kind of reminds me of those little experiments they do where the gerbil presses a lever and a little pellet comes out, and it's sort of what it reminds me of. But that was his notion of how things would work. And then things would miraculously go to testing, which was, of course, in his mind, a big cloud, and then they would get money from customers. So this is his model of how things worked. And he was very, very disturbed that the developers in the company were so slow. He thought the developers were a big problem. That's why I got called in, to fix the developers, which is what often happens, because we have some events here, things are slow, it must be the developers are slow. It must be the people. So I I drew a little picture about what the communication paths actually are. I talked to the developers, I learned something about the work they actually did, and I drew this picture. I'll show it to you a little bigger. So this is actually what was happening. That they had this prioritized work queue, and there were something like 300 different code packets in this company. And each developer knew about half a dozen of them. So depending on what pellet came out of the little queue when they pushed the lever, they might get a pellet that they knew something about, or they might get a work package that they had never seen because they only worked in their specialty, which meant that they then had to study the work, go find the person who knew about it, ask a bunch of questions, make some changes, go back to the person who knew about the work, have it reviewed, make some more changes, send it to testing, at which point they would find a problem. And the person in testing would go to the developer who knew about it and say, what's up? And that developer would say, well, I didn't work on it. You need to go talk to this other person. And that other person would then go talk to the person who knew something and then go talk to the tester. All the while, they were also getting requests from production. They were having customers ask them to do them a favor. So they did not have one nice, neat, single queue of work, right, with fungible people who could work on anything. They had a multi-network queue, they had non-fungible people, and they had interdependent work. So a simple depiction that shows events over time helped this manager see that really it wasn't the developers that were broken. It was a pattern related to the process that he had put in place, and it gave him some ideas about how we could change things. It gave him some leverage other than just saying, those developers are bad, those developers are slow, those developers are just not working hard enough. So sometimes very simple depictions can help us see something about the system we're working on. Another simple picture of a very, very common problem. How many of you work in, or courtesy of, now that I'm on the stage, I'll pronounce it wrong, HYBE, right? Oh, I got it close? Close. Close enough for an English speaker. Courtesy of HYBE, we drew this picture. This is actually a very, very common picture if you work in a matrix organization. How many of you work in matrix organizations? A handful of you, yeah. So the pattern, and I've seen this patterns in dozens and dozens of organizations, that a team is brought together and they're expected to work as a team, right? They're expected to collaborate. And what often happens, not in HYBE's case because he knows something about patterns and systems, but often what happens is the manager will say, what's wrong with you? Why aren't you acting like a team? Well, when you start drawing the underlying structures here, it becomes more clear why people aren't acting as a team. In any system, there are structural elements that are driving patterns of behavior. And one way to look at that is the containers that exist in the organization. Now, a container is anything that holds the focus of the group, and patterns form around it. So these people have a project or project team container, which is the dotted line, but they also have containers that represent their professional identity. We have testers here, we have developers here, we have UI people, each one of which reports to a different organizational department and has a different manager, which forms another container, because that manager may have different goals that are not completely aligned with the project. Is this sounding familiar to anybody? Yeah, I mean, a lot of us live in this sort of world, and when you look at all of the containers that are driving patterns of behavior, it's much easier to understand why people are not acting like a team, right? Because there is nothing holding them together, a shared goal, some identity as a group, as Linda talked about yesterday, that will actually help them cohere as a group, right? And act like a team, become a team. Because of the professional identities and because of the reward structures, people are looking at my piece of work and what my piece of work, if that's done, then everything is done. They're not bought into an overall goal related to a product. They're responding to how their manager is going to evaluate them. So rather than adhering to the team, they're paying more attention to what their manager wants from them. You know, in some ways, this is fairly simple because at least this group was all in the same place. Because very often people have additional containers that relate to their time zone, the building that they're in, their regional culture, you know, their local culture within the business unit. So all of these underlying structures are driving patterns of behavior. And as long as your only leverage point is to say act like a team, you're not going to get anywhere. But if you can depict something about the structures, you'll learn something about what's driving the pattern. And then you have more options to shift the pattern of behavior without simply telling people to behave differently. Because as long as the structures that hold the existing pattern in place don't change, the patterns of behavior won't change. Right? Those structures are holding the existing patterns in place. So there's actually a lot of things you can do here, right? You can look at having one manager for the team, so that the functional manager becomes more of a dotted line and that's not so salient and so strong a pull to meet those specific manager's objectives. You can soften the edges of the job descriptions so people are less focused on, well, I'm a BA, I don't do testing. Or I'm a developer, I don't do testing. You can strengthen the focus of our product goal so that people begin to really buy into, we are solving a particular problem that the customers are experiencing with our product, focusing them on creating some value for some actual human. That's actually a very strong pull for many, many people, right? It's a container. A goal is a container that focuses people together, working together, solving a problem together, which, as Linda said yesterday, is very, very powerful. And it will have a much greater effect on the pattern of behavior than just telling people to behave differently, right? So another way, another lens to look at what's going on and how you can potentially shift the pattern of behavior. How many of you have some idea about how you might shift this pattern? Any ideas about how you could shift this pattern in addition to the ones I mentioned? It must have been a really good party.
We had a thing where we aligned the expectations, even though we have different responsible managers for everyone.
Yeah.
We came up with a project-wide expectation that all those managers kind of needed to use, which the expectations always needed to have the team focus as a point. So we still had to follow the corporate structure, but we were able to at least somewhat mitigate the
Right.
kind of turn it to a less solid line, so
Right.
that it didn't pull as hard.
Exactly. That's another way to shift the container, is you make sure that the managers are all lined up and that, at least for the people on this project in this period of time, they have the same expectations, which eases up those functional management relationship containers. Who else has an idea about how you might shift this? Yeah.
Give everyone the same goal.
Yeah, give everyone the same goal, right? And make it focus on the product and make it very, very clear that, you know, if you do your requirements and the rest of the team does not make the commitment, you're not successful, right? So using goals as a container can be really powerful, right? Who has another idea?
Everybody the same job description.
Yeah, give everybody the same job description. That tends to dampen the differences, because differences are another structure that cause patterns of behavior here. And when people have highly differentiated job descriptions, it gets in the way of collaboration almost every time, right? Differences drive all sorts of patterns, right? Linda was talking about differences between containers yesterday, right? But there can be differences within a container that cause people to behave in different ways. When I was a manager in a company, I had a team that was made up of both employees and contractors. How many of you are in that situation? Yeah, that's very common. And I did my best to make sure that everybody was treated pretty much the same. We didn't really emphasize that difference because you can't have a team if you have two classes of people, right? It does not work. You have to have some sense that we are equally valued in order to have a team. Not that everybody makes exactly the same contribution or makes the same amount of money or has the same job title, but that we're equally valued, right? If you make someone other, as Linda said, it's going to be difficult for people to pull together as a team. So I worked really hard to dampen that difference between employee and contractor. And then we got a memo from on high. I think it might have had its origin in human resources trying to keep the company out of legal trouble, saying that if we had any sort of celebration and we had any treats, if we had a cake, for example, the contractors were not permitted to eat cake. I can't make this stuff up. No, we really got this memo. Contractors were not permitted to eat cake because then they might. Johanna is looking at me with this look of just utter disbelief. I swear, this is true. I could not make it up. So, human resources wanting to keep the company out of a lawsuit because one contractor had said, "Oh, I've been here for 30 years and now you're terminating my contract. I want unemployment." Well, that's another problem, to have somebody as a contractor for 30. We're not going to talk about that one. But they wanted to amplify a difference, which would have made it very, very difficult to get any work done in a collaborative fashion. So I ignored that memo, as I ignored many of those memos that came down from on high. Sometimes you have to. So changing the way people view differences can change the pattern of behavior. Changing the job descriptions is a very common one. Treating contractors as if they are of the same class is another one that makes a difference in the patterns of behavior you see. Okay. This idea of containers and differences and exchanges comes out of the work of Glenda Ouyang, who is looking at the application of chaos and complexity science to human organizations, to complex human systems. Very interesting work. And very useful for understanding patterns of behavior and shifting patterns of behavior in your organization. So those are a couple of fairly simple ways, but sometimes you need to understand the dynamics of a situation and you need to understand how various factors relate to each other and how various factors in the organization interact and what the relationships are. So what I often do, this is a funnel, by the way. Linda was talking about how she can't draw the other day, and I said, "Oh, honey, you wait till you see my slides. You'll realize you can draw." I often start this by looking at the simple diagram that shows the ripple effects throughout the organization, because that gets people started looking at what the related factors might be. So I'll switch back to that for a minute. So, when you do this, you can begin to see you can do this diagram and begin to see what some of the effects are. And that is a very effective way to get people brainstorming about what the factors might be. So I look at both qualitative factors and I look at quantitative factors. And I look at as many as I can think of, right? I just brainstorm as many as I can think of. And then I funnel them down to the ones that I think are most important. When you're looking at this sort of analysis, it's really important to keep a couple of things in mind, right? You need to think about things that are at least potentially measurable, right? Maybe not a good cost benefit to measure them because they might be difficult to measure, like morale. That's sort of difficult to measure. Quality, that's sort of difficult to measure sometimes. But things that are at least potentially measurable. And you want to state them as neutral or positive. Because when you start trying to reason about these factors, if they are stated in the negative, you get yourself into the difficult situation of saying, well, as the level of dissatisfaction goes up or the level of dissatisfaction goes down, and that just gets too confusing, right? So you need to have them be neutral and potentially measurable. And I check that by saying, can we think about this as the level of, or the amount of, or the number of, right? Nouns, noun phrases. And then you can start to do two different things with them. You can either look at behavior over time, or you can look at the dynamics of the system. So this is a behavior over time graph. How many of you have seen behavior over time graphs? Yeah, very useful for understanding how factors move together. They move in the same direction. They move in opposite directions. Perhaps you find out there's no relationship. But this graph comes from a company I worked with that discovered at their year-end review, the senior management year-end review, that none of their projects had come in on time or on budget. What a surprise. What a shocking surprise. So they decided that clearly people were slacking off because there were no consequences to not making budget. Does this sound familiar? Right? Once again, blaming people. So they decided that they were going to institute a bonus. So if you came in within plus or minus 5% of your original budget, you would get a bonus. And if you didn't, you would not. What do you think happened? Well, quality dropped, yes. What else do you think happened? Nothing. Well, actually something happened. And for about half the year, the budgets looked really good, right? Because people, give people a target and they will do whatever is necessary to meet that target, even if it means destroying the company. So that's, Mr. Deming said that. So they just gamed their budgets until it got to the end of the year, and it became quite clear that things weren't quite as rosy as they looked in the first 3 quarters. So the year-end review, once again, the senior managers said, well, these people must just not be competent. They're just not competent project managers. They're not competent. We'll get new people. So they went out and they hired a whole bunch of new project managers. Does this sound familiar? Yeah. They went out and hired a bunch of new project managers and set them to work on the new batch of projects. And what do you think happened? Yeah, the same thing happened. So the next year they decided they would implement a big methodology from a big company that shall remain nameless. But I bet you can guess who it was. Big methodology. One methodology that will cover all cases in the known universe, right? That was going to solve the problem. Because if it's not people, it must be process. And the people doing the process. Well, a year later, guess what? It was the same thing. So how many years had they spent now on this problem, focusing on the people? Well, actually, they spent about 5 years. And, at a certain point, I came in and I said, well, let's look at the data. Let's see if we can notice anything about the patterns. So we collected the data for all these years, and it turned out in all of the years that they had data, how many projects do you think had come in within plus or minus 5% of their original budget? Just a guess. Pardon?
All the ones that came in after they created the bonus.
No, actually in all the years they had data, which I think was, if I remember correctly, was 6 years. Other guesses? 1. So they had a pattern here. And they were really looking at the wrong place. They were looking at people and they were looking at process when it was really a pattern and they needed to understand something about the dynamics. So we looked at all the data and looked at the fact that, they had no projects come in on time. And we brainstormed a bunch of factors that could be related and came up with this little chart, which the bigger the original estimate, the end budget, the percent overrun of the budget increased exponentially, not linearly, exponentially. The more new technologies that were involved in a project, it increased exponentially. And the more stakeholder involvement, actually that they were less likely to come in over budget. They were still over budget, but it was by a lesser amount. So this gave them some different things to look at. This helped them see their pattern over time, right? And there are some very classical shapes that show up in behavior over time graphs. This exponential increase is one, an exponential decrease is another, a plateau, or the famous oscillating system. You guys know about oscillating systems? They come from delayed feedback because people don't understand the nature of the control of the system. Heating systems are very, very often like this. So you have a situation where the room is too cold, so someone cranks the heat up to 80, and then the room is too hot, so they turn it down to 60. I can't do this in Celsius. Who can do it in Celsius to Fahrenheit? Because I bet 80 sounds really, really warm to you guys, doesn't it? It would be a little uncomfortable. 30. So that 80 would be 30. What would 65 be? 15. So it oscillates between 30 and 15, right? Because there's a delay. The temperature doesn't change immediately and the sensor doesn't. And that's what happens when we have delayed feedback and we pull the levers too hard. That often shows up on these sorts of behavior over time graphs, right? Oscillation. Very useful for seeing patterns. Once you know something about the pattern, you know something about the dynamics of the situation, and you can begin to make some real changes. So this company actually did some smart things after 5 years. They started having much, much smaller projects. They didn't try to take on 4 or 5 new technologies in one project. They made sure that the customer was involved on a daily basis. Right? What is this starting to sound like? They delivered in small pieces, right? And made sure they were done as they went along. I don't know what they're doing now, but they did actually begin to see some results once they understood their pattern. So going back to our late for meetings pattern, in one company who was having that problem, we brainstormed some of the factors, and then we did something called a diagram of effects. And that's a way to understand the underlying dynamics of the system, right? It looks at understanding how variables affect each other. And there's actually, this looks sort of complicated, but it's actually only two relationships. Either A and B move in the same direction, in which case it's a plain arrow. As A goes up, B goes up. Or it's the inverse, and that's represented by a dot on the arrow. So as A goes up, B goes down, right? How many of you have seen these kind of causal loop diagrams before? Yeah. They can seem really complicated, but they're really based on only 2 different structures, right? Reinforcing loops and balancing loops. Kind of things that snowball, either in a vicious cycle or a virtuous cycle, and things that balance each other. So where do you see any balancing structures on this one? Any balancing structures for those of you who are used to looking at these? Oh, I'm sorry. I tried to write neatly. Yeah, this This is an interesting one because there's one vector here that seems to affect a lot of things, which is quality of facilitation. That seems to really affect a lot of things. So that tells you that that might be a place to intervene in this, right? Tells you there might be a place to intervene. And if you can find out where the balancing loops are, if they're holding a pattern in place that you don't want, then you see if you can tip that out of balance. If there are amplifying loops where it's just a vicious cycle, you see if you can dampen that a bit and you can balance that a bit. But a useful way to understand the underlying dynamics of your system. Yeah, I'll just let you absorb this for a minute. I know you're not going to be able to actually read the boxes, and that's for a reason, because this is from a company I have done some work with. This is a current reality tree, or a cause and effect diagram created by a guy named Lee Tucker, and they were having a lot of problems with their release process. And before Lee got there, they were just saying, "What's wrong with you people? Why are we having so much trouble with our releases? What's wrong with you? Can't you do better?" Maybe not. Given the system they were in, these people were doing the best that they possibly could. They were doing every bit as good as they could do given the system that they had to work with. And until they changed the system, there was nothing in the world that these people could do to make things work any better. There was nothing in the world they could do. So this sort of graph, actually it started on sticky notes and took up a wall about that size in the back, about half of that wall. They worked on it as a group. And what you do with this sort of diagram is you start with some central issues and you go up to the visible problems and you work down to the potential causes. And then you look for where are there reinforcing loops, where are there balancing loops, where do we have to untangle things to get them to work better. Lee actually found some fairly simple things to do in here. He found some fairly simple things about ordering things in a different way that made a huge difference. One of the things that he found to change in this that made a difference was he moved a meeting to a different day. That seems enormously simple, right? But because the meeting was happening once things were already in flight, it caused things to change because decisions would be made and they would change things that were going on in the ongoing system and the ongoing build, and so things would break. He changed one meeting, it made a difference. And I've actually seen that happen in a number of situations. Another company I worked with was having a lot of difficulty with their prioritization, and they were finding that the senior managers were coming in the middle of the sprint and saying, "Oh, no, we need to be doing that differently. You have to stop everything you're doing and we have to replan." They had tried new procedures, they had tried, process documents, they had tried direction, they had tried all sorts of things. And again, they moved a meeting. It made a huge difference. But up until then, they'd been blaming the people, right? They've been saying, "Why can't you make up your mind? Why can't you stick to a priority?" Well, it was part of the pattern that was driving the structure of behavior. So, an interesting set of diagrams, perhaps. So what do good people who are good at seeing and steering their systems do? There was some interesting research done. I think most of it was actually done in Germany by a guy named Dietrich Dorner. Does that name sound familiar? fascinating research about how people react to complex systems and solving problems in complex systems. And what he noticed was that the people who were least effective at dealing with systems, and these were all computer simulations of either towns or villages or ecological systems. But he found that the people who were least effective in dealing with systems asked fewer questions, and they tended to be what questions? They tended to be focused on events. And they made a lot of decisions early on, and they were big decisions, right? So they'd make big decision based on event data and send the system into either an exponential effect or an oscillation effect. The people who were better at dealing with complex systems observed. They asked a lot of questions. They asked what questions to get data. But then they asked why questions. They asked questions about what are the relationships between these things. They reasoned by analogy. So they would say, this is a watch factory. So that's a production process. What do I know about production processes that might be useful as I think about this? So they reasoned by analogy, but they didn't overgeneralize, right? They didn't blanketly generalize and stop asking questions. They'd make a small action, they'd wait, they'd see the effect, they'd ask some more questions, they'd take another small action. They didn't work on only one thing. They would say, these things are interrelated. We can't just work on one of these. We need to be, if we want things to work well, we need to work on these 3 different levels, right? So I'm working with a company now, and they want to accomplish some things, and the first consultant who came in to help them said, we just need to start up a bunch of Scrum teams. We just need to have 10 Scrum teams, and that will be great. It will be wonderful. And I said, well, maybe not so much. Maybe we need to work on these 3 things. Maybe we need to be working on continuous integration so that people are actually getting fast feedback. So we need some automated tests, and we need to be working on having continuous integration. And we need to be talking to the people in HR, because if everybody is still focused on their job description and they're still being given individual bonuses for heroic action, we're going to have a hard time getting people to work in a collaborative way. And we need to be working on the planning, right? Because if we don't have a steady stream of work flowing into these teams, it's going to be difficult for them to actually be effective in any sort of way. So we need to be working on these 3 things. Let's take these little actions, let's see how they work, and then we'll know where we need to move next, right? So the people who are good in this experiment at dealing with systems also did that. They would work on multiple things. They'd take small steps. They'd see how things were moving. They'd do another reality tree, right? They'd do another diagram to see how things had shifted, and then they'd try something else. So when we are asking what questions, we're asking about events, right? We're asking about events, and we're focusing ourselves in the now. Now, this doesn't mean you don't need data. You do need data, but you need data over time, right? That will help you see patterns. When you start asking questions about how things happen, when things happen, what's the relationship between how things happen, then you have a chance of seeing patterns. When you start asking why questions, why do these things work together this way? You're looking at even a broader span of time, right? You're looking at, in systems terms, geotime. So generally, people start asking questions in this order. Very often, people who are not proficient at dealing with systems get stuck in just looking at events and reacting to events without understanding what's going on. I don't know how it is here, but in the US, we are addicted to action, right? In business world, you are rewarded for being decisive and quick action, and it is far better to be certain and dead wrong than to be uncertain and approximately right. Right? So people ask a few what questions, they arrive at some conclusion without understanding the impact of action, without understanding the interrelatedness of the system, and they end up sending the system in the wrong direction, taking well-intended action that brings about the very events that they were hoping to avoid. The power of the questions is in the inverse order, right? What questions are useful? But we need to understand the why. We need to understand the underlying why of what's going on within our systems if we want to stand any chance of changing them. We need to take time to reflect. We need to make a change, see how it's happening, make some adjustments to our thinking, model some more, see what we can deduce about the underlying structures and the behaviors of the system so that we can move it in a different direction. So when you're thinking about something you want to change in your organization, you might start by asking some questions about what's happening, first in the near term, but then looking back later in time. So looking at the past and the near past. Gather data, see what you can depict it, how you can depict it. Maybe you can come up with a graph, or maybe you can draw something about, draw a diagram of effects. Frame the issue, gather data, depict, model, form a goal. Spend some time thinking about what you don't want to change, because that's a big mistake people make in systems, is they don't think about what they don't want to change, and those are your implicit goals. Think about how you will evaluate the change. How will we know that we're moving in the right direction? How will we know that we've made a change in the way we want to go? Build in some feedback loops so that you'll get information back. Act small, check on what's going on. And build your toolbox. Build your toolbox. It's not enough to have one tool when you're working with systems. I listed several tools here, right? You can do the shape of the problem, just understanding what the ripple effects are. You can look at the underlying structures, looking at the containers and the differences that are driving patterns of behavior. Those are really good if you're seeing patterns of human behavior within a small group, right? Those are excellent for that. If you want to see patterns in results, right, you might look at a behavior over time graph that will tell you something about how factors are interrelated. Or you might use a diagram of effect to understand systems dynamics. If you're trying to understand root causes behind a pattern that exists in time, you might use the current reality tree or a bigger cause and effect diagram. But you need to build your toolbox in order to be a good steerer of systems, right? If you really want to bring about change, creating a vision isn't enough. Asking for action isn't enough. You need to know the right action to take based on what's happening underneath the events in your system. What's going on underneath the surface. When you can see patterns, you no longer have to blame people. So I'm going to end with another story about people and patterns and how it shifts the way people think about whether it's actually someone else's fault or whether it's part of a pattern. I took part in a workshop, a year-long workshop several years ago. So it was a cohort of people who met several times over the course of a year. And there was one guy in our group who frankly kind of drove me crazy. His name was Wally. And kind of like the robot, but different. And Wally liked to say things 3 times. And he liked to make these sort of sententious pronouncements. And each one would be repeated 3 times. So, trust is the essence of change. 2 more times. And I'm not going to do that to you. And if you stopped him at 2, his counter would reset. So he had to say everything 3 times. And you know, I mean, it was kind of an annoying habit to me. But he also took a long time in his presentations. You know, we had various presentations we were supposed to give, 7 minutes, 10 minutes, whatever. His would be 14 or 20, he was at least 100% over on all of his presentations. And when he would be, saying things for the 3rd time, or he'd be going over, I would look around the room to see how other people were responding to this. Because if you really want to see what is going on in a group, you don't watch the person who's speaking, you watch the other people in the group. And I noticed that people were like, sometimes this means I'm cold, but sometimes it means, oh God. So people would be sitting there looking at the ceiling or looking at the floor, or, kind of looking at their watch. And Wally would be up there going on and on and on. I'm getting a signal from here, so I'm trying to understand what the signal is. Oh, okay. Well, we're fine. We're good. This story will not take 10 minutes, I promise you. If Wally was telling it, it might. Oh, that was not nice of me. So I noticed that everybody was just kind of like showing signs that they were not. They were frustrated with this behavior, and I noticed that I was feeling more and more irritated. And I started wondering, why don't the leaders of this seminar do something about this guy? Why don't they do something about him? I started feeling really irritated with Wally. So one day he was giving a presentation, and he started by saying, I'm going to play some music. I'm going to play some music. I'm going to play some music. And you should get up and sway to the music, sway to the music, sway to the music, because this time is for you. And at that point, I sat down and I said, well, if this time is for me, I'm going to check my email. So I sat there and I checked my email, and everyone else swayed to the music. And when it got to be 12 minutes, I said, Wally, it's been 12 minutes, you should wrap up. And when it got to be 15 minutes, the instructor said, Wally, it's been 15 minutes, you should wrap up. Take 1 minute. And the pattern shifted. Wally did look a little stunned when this happened, I will admit. But after that, everyone was a little more honest with Wally, right? And when he started going on about something that no one could understand how it connected to the material we were supposed to be covering, someone would say, Wally, I'm not sure how that connects. Can you either explain it or we take it offline? And someone, when Wally was going over time, would say, Wally, do you want me to time for you? Right? So we were in a pattern, right? We were in a pattern. I was part of the pattern because I wasn't saying anything. And when you can't name a pattern, what people do is they blame, right? When you can't name the pattern, people blame. They blame the leaders for not dealing with it. They blame the person who's behaving in a particular way. You're in a system problem when in spite of attempts to fix it, the problem comes back, or when you change the people and the behavior continues, right? You're in a system problem then. You're in a pattern when events repeat and repeat and repeat. And then if you find yourself blaming, you can look at the pattern and see what part you play. Because maybe you play a big part, right? But blame is almost always a symptom of something, right? And if we're focused on the people as the problem, we're never going to get to fix the underlying issue. We're never going to see the pattern. We're never going to see the system structures. And we'll never bring change. So work on your system skills. Try some of these simple diagrams when you go back to work. You know, if there's a simple problem that continues in your organization that shows up and it seems like it's a people problem, try drawing that shape of the problem. Try drawing that central problem and see who else is affected by this. Who else is affected by this, and what does this tell me about the complexity and interrelatedness of this problem? See if you can brainstorm some factors that might be involved and see how those factors are related. If it's a pattern of human interaction, maybe draw a diagram that shows the containers and see if you can get some ideas on how to shift those patterns. And you'll find that you're able to bring much more change to your organization when you look underneath the surface, get beyond events, move out of blame, start steering your system. So I believe I have a few minutes for questions. Yeah? And I will take them now. Well, perhaps I explained everything perfectly, or perhaps it was a really good party.
Yo.
Or,
Any questions? Here.
Yeah.
Is it easy to see, to detect pattern when you are inside the system? Or is it more easier to see the system defect when you are outside of the system? Because even when you're aware of dynamic of system, it's very difficult to see the element where you're also part of the system. When you want to change the company, do you think it's better to ask people outside of the system to analyze it, or if it's possible to do it inside?
So it is often difficult to see your own part in the pattern. I mean, and it's difficult to see, it's like fish aren't aware of water, right? They just swim in it. We aren't aware of air, we just breathe it. So it takes some discipline to become aware of the system. And that's one of the reasons I told the last story, is because I was part of that pattern and I had to ask myself that question. What part do I play in this pattern, right? So you can ask, what part do I play? You know, I see a pattern here. I think that's one of the reasons it's important to do some modeling, right? To have a whole toolbox of ways that you can start drawing your system or depicting your system in some way, because that will help you see things about it, even if you're inside the system, right? Sometimes it is easier for people from the outside to see certain things, right? That's why it sometimes can be helpful to have an outsider come in, because they may see things that have just become so routine to everybody in the organization that they don't think about the fact that we're doing something in a particular way that may not make sense anymore, right? I had several years ago, we got a new refrigerator and we had to try to get the refrigerator out the door, and it got stuck, right? And I was stuck in my office with a 5-year-old who was visiting, and there was no way out of my office, right? So I'm sitting there thinking, well, what the heck am I going to do? I'm stuck in my office. This refrigerator is stuck here. I have to go someplace, and I can't get out. And I was at a loss. And the 5-year-old said, why don't you go through that door? Well, because I'd had a bookcase in front of it for several years, and I had stopped thinking of it as a door, right? So I moved the bookcase and opened the door. And that's what happens when you're in systems. I mean, these things don't just happen to me, do they? But yeah, you just become so used to things that you don't see them. And diagramming can help. And if that doesn't help, then maybe get someone in from the outside who can see some things that aren't visible to the people who have just become accustomed to the way things are.
More questions? Okay.
Yeah.
Sometimes parties benefit from patterns,
Oh, yeah.
but are not good for the company, but
Oh, yeah.
for the manager involved as benefit of not breaking the pattern.
Yes.
And if you are part of the organization, it's not possible, not easy to break the pattern because of the management who has no trigger to change the pattern.
Yeah, to quote Jerry Weinberg, no matter how bad the situation looks, it's good for somebody, right? So somebody is benefiting from it, and then I would look at, I would start looking at for me personally, I would start looking at containers, differences, and exchanges to see where I could shift some of that. But it's very, very common, particularly I see this when organizations are moving to Agile methods, that they tell the people on the teams that they need to work differently, but they don't tell the managers they need to work differently. So the incentive structures are the same, the expectations for the role are the same, and it makes it very difficult to, hit a ceiling here. I would start looking at what I could shift within my own arena, right? And I might start talking to other folks about the effects to see if we could actually get some movement to have it looked at a more systemic level, right? Not particularly the nice answer you wanted, but it's very difficult at that point, and that's why when you're looking at the systemic change, you need to look at the structures that are holding the existing pattern in place, right?
More questions? The last one. Okay. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much.
Oh, how lovely. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
So, guys, enjoy the conference today.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.